grandmother's garden, and I'm going to be showing you how to take that through the developmental stages, and then after that we're going to work on a tree that has been developed 2 years later, where we can then take a tree into the refinement stages of bonsai. So this is the tree we're going to be working on here today, and as you can see, it is a big Lonicera that I dug up from my grandmother's garden, and this species is also known as a hedging honeysuckle, so it is quite common for people to use this species in their garden as a hedge, and then years later, whenever they decide I don't want to hedge there anymore, let's put a fence or something else, you can dig them up and they make excellent specimen for bonsai. This particular tree was just growing at the side of a fence, probably been growing there for the last 5 years, so it has put on quite a lot of growth. When I was digging it up, I didn't want to remove too much roots. I just pulled it up, and then any big roots that were keeping it locked to the ground, I cut them with the root cutters, and this is what I got. I really like this species for bonsai too because it has them beautiful small leaves, which are quite commonly seen in species like Chinese elm, Zelkova, the Ilex crenata or Japanese holly, and of course this one. If you are digging these trees up, the best time to do so is in early spring. Right now is spring. And now before we start, the tools that I'll be using in this video today are some branch cutters, twig cutters, chopsticks, some root pruning shears, root cutters, wire cutters, and finally some gin pliers. And if you're just getting started in bonsai and this is the first bonsai video you've seen, by no means do you need all these specialized bonsai tools. When I got started, I just got by with some ordinary garden scissors and a cheap pair of secateurs. Chopsticks are pretty easy to come by. You just want to make sure that whatever tools that you do use are clean and sharp. Clean because you don't want to introduce any bacterial or fungal infections to any trees that you work on. And sharp because sharp tools will actually cut a lot cleaner on a tree or root. And in horticulture, sharp cuts do heal so much faster and more efficiently than a blunt cut that was sort of squashed by a dull pair of scissors. When it comes to working on materials, specifically like this one where the roots are exposed to the air and sunlight, you want to keep a spray bottle of water nearby just to mist the roots as you work on it so they don't dry out, because essentially if these roots do dry out, it will seriously affect the health of the tree. The tree could die if there's no roots left. I would probably want this tree to be about this height, and this is one of the things it comes to when working with collected material. It will never ever look, well, I'm not going to say never, but the majority of the time, it never looks like a bonsai right away from the get-go. Most of the time, you're working with a stump, and then later, as the tree gets healthy and you build on that, you can create the bonsai shape and design from there. I wouldn't go as far as calling this tree a Yamadori, which means it's collected from the wild. I have heard some people say urban dori, which is like collected from the garden. But when it comes to working with material like this, we do have a different approach. And you're sort of thinking maybe 5-10 years ahead of the tree's future, what it could become, rather than how can I make this look great right now. And as you guys know, every bonsai will have a front or preferred viewing angle. This tree, to me, it has this nice split here in the middle, so maybe this side or this side could become a nice front. As it is right now, this tree is too tall, so taking the branch cutters, I'm just going to shorten it in height. You could earlier these off if you wish to, but these grow so fast that I really don't need to do that. Just taking this tree down in height. See, there's all these long shoots that we just don't need at the moment. And by taking off all of this foliage also, it takes the strain off the little roots that this tree now has. So not only will it improve how the tree looks as a bonsai, but it does improve the health of the tree too. This branch is just unneeded. As it is right now, all I'm thinking on is in terms of the trunk line. How nice would that look in like 5 years time if this had lots of nice branches and a nice triangular shape? Because I know this particular species is really okay to prune, I'm going to go quite harsh on this one. I'm going to take off things like here. On the top of the tree here, as you can see, there's many branches coming from the one spot. And if we leave these on the tree, we'll get what's known as inverse taper. And this is a swelling on this area of the trunk that we really don't want, because in bonsai, you want it to go from thick to thin up to the top of the tree. So for that reason, I'm going to remove this thickest branch. I feel like it's just a little bit out of place in relation to the trunk line. There's another thick one here that also looks out of place in relation to the trunk line. It's just sort of going off at a weird angle. Alright, even then if I wanted to, I could just cut this tree right here. Yeah, I'm going to do that. Just give it a clean cut so it starts nice and fresh. And this is now how the tree is looking. As you can see, we're showing off that lovely trunk line. It's got quite a nice nubari beginning at the bottom. And I think as it is right now, this tree is looking really nice as a start for a bonsai. There is one thing I would like to mention, and when you dig up trees, no doubt you will have weeds. And in this case, we got lots of grass. I don't want this developing in the pot when I repot this, so get rid of any grass you may see, any of these weeds. Try and get them out by the root if you can so that they don't come back. There's quite a lot here. All of that was just root from the grass. It looked like it was root from the tree. I'm going to take a chopstick and try and work out the roots just a little to see if I can get rid of all these grass ones like that. And this developmental stage in bonsai really is probably one of the most exciting parts whenever you get started, because you're creating something from more or less scratch. And this doesn't have to be very complicated. You know, there's another tree, that's a Lonicera, so you could actually find yourself some suckers that have roots at the base. And setting a tree up like this really doesn't have to be complicated. The number one priority when it comes to these kind of trees and setting them up from raw material is just to get the tree healthy. If this tree wasn't that healthy or wasn't even the same species, for example, if I had collected a juniper or a pine, I probably wouldn't even have touched any of the foliage. I would have taken it out of the ground, put it into a pot, see how it responds to that, and then take it from there in maybe a year or 2 years time. So collecting bonsai really is a different realm versus working from garden center material. But again, this species can really handle what I'm doing today. When it comes to repotting this tree, and when it comes to even the majority of trees that you're working with, when it comes to collected material, your main priority really should be get the tree healthy, and then later, when it's happy, you can work on it. So for that reason, I'm going to be planting this tree into a pond basket. Pond baskets like this encourage lots of healthy rooting and lots of fine feeder roots. Because baskets have holes all the way around, when the roots grow in them, when they reach the side of the pot, they're air pruned off, so they sort of come out a little bit, dehydrate in the sun, and that encourages more roots further back to develop. So no roots are really allowed to go out and begin circling the pots that you would see in regular flower pots. The soil mix that I'm using in this video today is a mix of pumice, akadama, lava rock, and zeolite. And some of you guys were asking in the comments, what is the point of zeolite? I find zeolite does help to absorb nutrients and retain them in the soil just a little bit longer. And then as time goes on, the zeolite slowly releases the nutrients into the tree's roots. It's really important that if you do have soil like this, to sieve it before you put it into the pot. This just gets rid of any fine particles that may be in the soil. I find personally, if the soil isn't nice and sieved like this, it can affect drainage, because all the fine particles make their way down into the bottom of the pot and it sort of clogs it up. So it doesn't take 2 minutes just to sieve all your soil before getting it into the pond basket. And just as you would do repotting any bonsai, we're going to create that classic little mountain in the middle. And this just ensures that whenever we put it in the pot, there isn't any air gaps underneath. And as I sit this in here, I can already see this root is a little too long. We're just going to shorten these thick ones. And the thick roots in bonsai really don't matter all so much, because they don't feed the tree. What feed the tree is these small fine feeder roots. So it's really completely okay to remove the thick ones that's preventing it from getting in the pot. Another one here, that one's quite thick and it's coming up also. We don't really want that. In the nubari, or the surface roots, you want a nice radial flare. And now let's see if it sits in the pot. That sits in there pretty nicely. We can just tuck all these little roots down so that all of them are used for water and nutrient absorption. You don't want to cut off any of the feeder roots if you don't have to. Now when it comes to securing this tree in the pot, if you wish to, you could wire it in like you would a normal bonsai tree by simply putting wire up through the bottom, around the root ball, and holding it in place. Alternatively, if you don't want to use wire, you could cover it with soil, sit stones on top, then wait until the roots fill the pot and you can take the stones off. But what I'm going to do today is take some chopsticks. You want to make sure that they're wooden so they're a little bit gentler on the roots. I'm going to stick it through the pond basket and across and out one of the other holes. Then I'm going to do the same across this way. So I find just taking some scissors to make a little hole helps you get it through, because the holes on the pond basket just aren't big enough. So I'm just going to put this through like that. And the great thing about using chopsticks like this is whenever it establishes in the pot, it's not that difficult to just pull them out and the roots will establish in the place of where these chopsticks were. You could, if you wish to, put more chopsticks going along this way, but I think once I fill this with soil, it'll be completely fine. And now with a chopstick, we're going to work out any air gaps that's in the soil. And we do this because anywhere there's air in the pot is essentially where water cannot reach. So by working out all the air gaps with the chopstick, you ensure that all the soil becomes real estate for the roots to form into. And you can really just take your time with this. I think it's much better to take a little bit longer in doing something, but where it's done correctly, rather than rushing something just to get it out of the way. And even when I'm stabbing in here with the chopstick, I'm coming in at an angle, that way I get right under the root ball where all the air gaps is. And if you push with your finger, it's another technique you can find that you just do find more and more spaces for the soil to be worked into. And because this tree has just been repotted, all this soil here is quite dry. So by having that around the roots, it's beginning to pull moisture quite quickly out of the roots into the substrate. So as soon as you repot your tree into this type of soil, I would advise watering it as soon as possible. Otherwise, all that soil is going to draw the nice moisture that's in the roots out. And then on top of this, I'm going to take some wet sphagnum moss and place this on the surface of the soil. And this will just keep the soil nice and humid during the summer and just over the next few weeks so that the soil doesn't dry out too quickly. I'm pretty happy with that. So this is all the foliage that I have removed from that Lonicera, and there's even more down there. And of course, if you wish to, with these pieces that you cut off the Lonicera, you can take cuttings from this tree and grow more trees from this. And when it comes to taking cuttings, you can take what's known as a nodal cutting or a heel cutting. A heel cutting is when you take a branch that's already connected to a large branch like this, peel it off right from the trunk. This little piece here is what's known as the heel. You want to cut that about here, strip off the lower leaves. You can dip this end in some hormone rooting powder, and even with Lonicera you really don't have to use any rooting powder. I find they just root. And when you stick it into soil, you want to make sure that it's planted half the depth of the cutting. So for example, if the cutting was this height, you would want to plant it up to here. And now when it comes to taking a nodal cutting, for example, this little branch here, the nodes on a branch are these little sections below the leaves. So if I wanted it to root from here, I would cut this just under them leaves. That's the node, and then strip off the bottom leaves. If you really want to increase your chances of it rooting, I would use rooting hormone with the active ingredient IBA, also known as indole-3-butyric acid. But again, this species Lonicera, it really doesn't need that. They're such prolific growers. And now moving on to this Lonicera, and this particular tree has been in this pond basket for the last 2 years. And this tree started off and was collected from the exact same garden, just how that last Lonicera that we planted did. As your raw material develops, depending on how vigorously it's growing, you can work on it as it develops in the pond basket. I did prune this tree in a video last year. All we did was just give it a basic profile cut, removed any branches that didn't seem like they were working for the design. I think that's one of the important things, even when working with raw material, as the tree begins to get healthy and you can work on it. If you see any glaring problems in the trees, like branches that are too thick, competing with the thickness of the trunk line, if there's any suckers growing at the base, I find it does help to address them problems early on, because first of all, if you don't, later on it's going to become an even bigger problem. And second of all, if you remove things like little suckers, the tree can then redirect energy into better places like the apex that you do want to develop. So to repot this, I'm just going to start by tipping it on its side and just pulling it out of the pot. This is looking really healthy. It's got lots of healthy roots all around. Even on the bottom here, check out this mat of roots all the way around the pot. Now is the perfect time to repot a tree like this. I'm just taking a bamboo chopstick. You don't want it to be metal because you could harm all these nice delicate roots. I'm just raking away some of this old soil to really see if we can reveal an abari. We are beginning to get into just the very start of the refinement stage. The sucker here is just bothering me a little, so I'm going to remove that. I know it's never going to be needed in the end. And as I work on this tree, I'm working outward from the trunk. That way I don't tear through any roots that's growing laterally by pulling around in a circular motion. And even if it helps you, you can rotate the tree I like to work either towards myself or away from myself like this. So as I turn it, I'm always working the same way. I don't really like to move my hand around. I just find it too awkward. So I wouldn't be using a bent fork on the tree like this, because at this point now I see the roots as being quite valuable because they're all adding to the nebari. I don't want to have any risk of damaging them with a metal tool. I know I'm definitely not going to be making use of this mat around the edge of the tree here, so with the root pruning shears, I'm just going to cut that off, or you can even pull it off like this. And I will actually include an image of how this tree started when I got it and I first put it into this pond basket. It really didn't look like much compared to how it looked now 2 years later. So it just shows you can develop a pretty nice start of a bonsai in the space of only 2 years, and it really doesn't need to be complicated. You just take one step at a time. And now, just to wash off any of the extra soil, I'm just dipping this tree in some water, giving the roots a nice wash. And as you can see, the nebari on this tree is pretty nice. It's got a nice radial pattern the whole way around. Now we're going to do a little bit of root refinement, and that is simply pruning the roots back to areas where they curl like this. So as you can see, this root, it comes out, curls around. I can cut that here, don't need that. I want to keep these roots fairly long, but anywhere it just gets a little too long like this, I'm going to cut just a profile cut the whole way around. You want to make sure that the shears you use for this are nice and sharp. That way the roots heal so much more quickly. This is probably one of the best nebaris that I've shown on my channel so far. It really just does have all the traits that we want. From this point, if you wish to, you could stick this back into a pond basket, let it grow more, keep doing that over and over. But as it is right now, I'm extremely happy with this root base. What I'm going to do today is get this into a nice ceramic bonsai pot. This will slow the growth of the tree down, and then over the next few years, we can then begin to build ramification on the apex. So now I would say we're at quite an important phase of a bonsai's life, because it's time to choose the pot. How do you know what type of pot to choose? Circular, rectangular, shallow, deep? When it comes to pots in bonsai, there's so many variations. Some of it is down to personal preference, some of it is down to tradition. Like junipers, they like to be put in unglazed ceramic bonsai pots, where things like maples be put in glazed pots. Then there's the shape of the pot. Sometimes you want to emphasize the lines of a tree. If the tree's got this nice elegance to it, perhaps you could even use a rectangular pot to offset that. It all depends on what you want to do and what you want it to look like in the end. And remember, bonsai means plant in pot or tree in pot, so the pot is just as important as what we have done to the tree. So if this is, say, a finished tree, we put it in this pot, that could look quite nice. It's quite a deep pot, so it would help the tree develop. There is a rule in bonsai, well, not a rule, I don't like to say rule, but guideline, that the thickness of the tree should be the depth of the pot. So look at this little small pot, that's about the thickness of the tree. If that was somehow put in there, wouldn't that look just beautiful? So I'd say even, I would have to prune quite a lot of root, but I know this tree would survive no problem in there. So that is a candidate. There's this one that was sent to me by Jason Hanrahan from the Bonsai Garden. We won this on one of his giveaways on his channel. This is also nice and shallow, around the same thickness of the trunk. That could look quite nice in there. That's another good candidate. So even as I look through different pots, look at this one. That one's quite nice too. It's good to try different ones. Don't just think, oh, it has to be this one, it's tradition. Sometimes the traditional method might not work for every tree, because every tree has different characteristics to it. This rectangular one, that one, would it work? Would it look nice in a rectangular pot? I don't think so. This is just not the kind of tree I'd want in a rectangular pot. So I would say this one is probably better for, you know, quick growth on the tree. It's nice and deep, but I don't want the tree to grow that much quickly anymore, as I'm going to start slowly refining it, and I want the internodes to be shorter. The green of this pot is quite harmonious with the color of leaves, so maybe that could be a nice candidate. I'm just trying to think and look at it from all angles. Okay, so I'm going to eliminate this one also, because I just feel that the design of this, the lovely design on this, is a little bit too active for the flowy nature of this tree. Let's try this super small one. That's also green. My brain really likes the super small one, but we are going to have to cut off quite a lot of roots. Again, that's not a problem. It is doable, but would it look nice? I don't think it would show off the nebari as much as I'd want, so maybe we're down to this one. I'm going to go with this pot. So that was me just explaining my thought process of what goes through my mind as I look for a pot to match a tree. I don't know if that's useful. Let me know in the comments. So now to fully prepare the roots for this pot, if you set the tree over the pot, you will notice there's some roots hanging over the edge. You don't want to go trying to stuff these roots into the pot, because ultimately when these roots grow and thicken, and it's going to go completely against that nice radial thing we were going for before. So what I like to do in this scenario is cut the roots a little bit thinner than the pot, so that when they're in the pot over the next year or two, they have space to grow into. So I'm just going to cut this in the same sort of shape as the pot. You can lay it on the pot just to see what's going on. All right, so let's get rid of all these roots I cut off. Cut off quite a bit. Now let's see how it goes into the pot. Lots of room around the edge, and this will really help the tree long term. Let's look at the base of the roots also. Here I'm just going to cut this so that it's nice and flat, getting rid of any thick ones that might be growing straight down. And finally, that's all I'm going to do with root work. So putting the tree aside, as you can see on the bottom of this pot, I've prepared it with some bonsai mesh, just wired it in, and this is to stop any substrate from falling out of the pot. And now just taking some 1.5mm aluminium bonsai wire. I'm using this gauge of wire because this is quite a small tree, but if you had a bigger tree, perhaps you would use thicker wire to wire it in. I'm just measuring the wire along the bottom of the pot like this. Then we can cut that with the wire cutters. And I like to measure it like this just so that I don't waste any wire. So we're going to feed that up through the bottom of the pot. I like to bend it at a right angle here just so that it comes out a little bit easier. And it looks a little bit neater whenever we pull it down like that. So that is ready to put the tree in. And for this tree, I'm just using the same bonsai soil mix that we used before. I'm creating a little base layer along the bottom, and then creating that little mountain in the middle. Don't worry if the mountain is a little bit too high, like this, it's coming out of the top of the pot, because whenever we take the tree and sit it on this, we squish it down, it fills out really nicely. And because we're getting this somewhat into a show-ready state, it's not a show tree, but a show-ready state, you really want to think about the front of the tree as you do this, so that it's sitting at the correct angle, nice viewing angle. Then you can think about composition. Do you want to sit in right in the middle of the pot, slightly to the left or right? For me, I want this dead center, but some trees, to make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, you can have it offset to one side to incorporate the rule of thirds. So let me just demonstrate what I mean. In composition theory, there's many different compositional guidelines that we can use when placing a tree into a pot. When styling a tree, the most common of these is the rule of thirds, and that is simply by placing something a little bit to the right or left, top or bottom, to make something look a lot more pleasing to the human eye. So this tree right now is dead center, but if I were to place this tree off center, I would probably put it to this side because it leaves nice empty space for these branches to fill. If I put it on this side of the pot, it does look a little bit claustrophobic on this side, and this side of the pot looks a little bit too bare. Maybe in the future I will adjust the composition of this, but for now I'd like it nice and central. So I'm just taking the wire over the tree like this, being careful not to squash any of these nice roots that are growing radially. Over here, the top of the root base, the same with this side, and then we can just twist these two wires together. And this will just hold it nicely. Then I'm going to take the gin pliers, holding the tree with my hand so it stays nice and secure. We can just pull, twist, and we can slowly tighten the tree into the pot. You don't want it too tight, but just enough to hold it there. And then in, say, maybe 3 weeks time, we can remove this wire. I don't usually do this, but because this is such a nice tree, I'm going to clip the wire. Then I'm going to fill the rest of this in with more soil. Going to give this tree a little watering. And when it comes to a first watering, you want to water it so that all the fine particles that may still be there after you've sieved it are completely gone. So you want to do it, see here, it's coming out the bottom of the pot. I'm going to do this until the water drains clear. Now it is time to give this tree a prune, and not only does this tree need a prune, as you can see it's kind of getting out of control, but by doing such a drastic repot like this, by removing that many roots, taking off a little bit of foliage on the top will also help to balance the vigor of the tree. That way there's not too much strain on these little roots to feed all this foliage. I'm going to take off some of the ends of these branches just to keep the tree in check. This is going to be a little pad here, so I'm going to shorten all of these down to maybe the first 1 or 2 sets of leaves, just to keep it nice and compact. This one here is coming right from the base of this branch, and we will get inverse taper, so let's get rid of that. There's also one growing right at the crotch of the branch. We can get rid of that. This is a sucker right in at the base, so this branch has got to go. This one is getting quite long, and I like how it's developing. It's starting to fill this gap that was once there in the tree, so I'm going to keep this, let this branch develop. Let's give this a flat top, so I'm just going to come in, prune all that. Maybe with this branch I can prune it just a little because I don't want it to compete with the trunk line. I do want to keep it still a side branch, so I'll cut that to there. I really don't want to have to wire this tree because I think this tree would be much more suited to build ramification by a clip and grow, and I'm always leaving a set of leaves on each branch that I do prune, and the majority of the time I'm pruning it back and as far as I can, so even here, prune that right into there. This branch here is going down and then up. It's got a weird line to it, so any of these undergrowing branches I'm going to get rid of. Just don't think it works. You have to remember too that this is a hedging plant, so you can just trim it like you would a hedge and it will grow back no problem. This part here, I'm still questioning this branch. I find it's quite repetitive in terms of the branch below it. If I remove this branch below it and had this one, there's the problem of these handlebar branches. That's directly opposite this one. I don't think that works, so I'm going to remove this middle one. That way now eventually when this one grows and fills out, it'll fill that gap nicely. This tree is going to look quite bare when I'm finished with it, but it really is important for the ramification long term. And here I even feel like this part is a little bit too congested. I'm going to remove a little branch here just to thin it out a bit. A little branch in here. Oftentimes with these things, less is more. There's a branch growing under here. There's quite a lot going on in this area also, so I'm just going to thin this back. And then there's branches growing on the underside of there. Maybe I can get rid of these. With Lonicera, you can really experiment also because they grow so vigorously. If there's a branch I remove here, no doubt it will be back next year. Could I even cut that into here? It would look quite bare. Instead, I'm just going to remove this one. Any branches growing in towards the center of the planting, I'm either going to get rid of or shorten. So these ones here, they're growing in. This little branch here could be wired up. I think it creates some depth back here, so I'm going to keep it for now. We did prune this quite harshly, but I think long term when creating ramification and a nice branch structure, this is the foundation that everything will be built on. I think it is necessary.